got that working? Okay, we can kill the camera on myself. That's intimidating. Let's get the
that glow
let's get the committee at large, please. Thank you. My good friend Rod Sinks. Okay, so welcome everybody to this.
I'm not controlling the cameras today. We have an expert crew in the basement of City Hall doing that.
You're the power behind the power. Thank you for coming today. This is our State Route 85 Corridor Policy Advisory Board for Tuesday, July the 2nd at 10 o'clock. And it's a summer recess for a lot of us, so we appreciate everybody coming out today. So I believe we'll start with a roll call, please.
Here.
Here.
Member Benson, alternate member Sayles, member Kern, member Camus, member Klein, alternate member Fong,
Present.
vice chairperson Miller,
Here.
chairperson McAllister.
Here.
We have quorum.
Excellent. Okay. So we're going to have some real good discussion today. I have a good feeling. And yeah, they'll know that Johnny Camus is walking in the door as we speak. So that is great. Okay, so we're going to start off today's meeting with public comments. So if anybody would like to take this portion of the agenda, it is reserved for persons desiring to communicate, to address the committee on any matters not on the agenda. Speakers are limited to 2 minutes. Law does not permit the committee action or extended discussion on any item not on the agenda, except under special circumstances. If committee action is requested, the matter can be placed on a subsequent agenda. All statements that require response will be referred to staff after replying in writing. And I do have Stephen. Here's your opportunity to speak now.
Thank you. I'd just like to make the point that VTA should concentrate more on providing roadways, which is part of its mandate, and not providing transit services. And in that line, I'd like to remind you a few things from the Santa Clara County Grand Jury report. VTA deficit was $25 million. Between 2009 and 2018, there was nearly a 20% drop in ridership on transit services provided by VTA, and even though there was such a drop, the number of employees, the number of buses, the number of light rail vehicles, and the number of employees driving them increased with a 20% drop in ridership. The VTA light rail budget has grown by 54% in the past 5 years, although the light rail ridership declined by 15%. The East Ridge light rail extension cost $600 million for 2.4 miles. And that's expected to bring in 611 new riders. So it costs about $1 million per rider for light rail. You could buy each person their own super vehicle to drive themselves to work or provide limousine service for them every day, and it costs VTA less money. Light rail is a total losing proposition. And I'd like you to keep this in mind. Again, VTA should be providing lanes for people to drive on roads and not providing infrastructure and any more light rail service, because it's all a failure. And the bus service is being cut back too, if you're familiar with the latest plans to significantly reduce bus service through most of the county. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else would like to take the opportunity to speak during this portion of the meeting? Otherwise, I will close public comment. We will start, go to the orders of the day. Does anybody have any members or staff have any changes to the orders of the day? Seeing none, we will stay with the orders of the day. Now we'll go to item 4, receive committee staff report.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a very quick report. You'll notice I am not Chris Augenstein, who has been previously sitting in this chair. He is enjoying the second day of his well-deserved retirement. So Chris will no longer be at these meetings, but these will be staffed either by myself or by Carolyn Gonod. So just wanted to let everyone know Chris is off, and he enjoyed working with the group, but he is enjoying his retirement, and that's my report.
Okay, thank you.
I have to ask, isn't Carolyn moving to Utah? So doesn't that mean you're going to be staffing these?
That is correct.
Forever?
So that is a very likely, and depending on when the next meeting is, it will most likely be myself.
Okay, thank you. You're
Jim,
not getting out of it.
Jim, could you give us an update on the organizational activities of the VTA at this particular time to sort of give us a sense of who's who?
The challenge with that, Director McAllister, is that it is not an agendized item.
Oh, it isn't? Okay.
I would beg your indulgence, and perhaps I could provide an emailed summary of what the changes are.
And that couldn't go under staff reports, since it's not really it's an informational item?
Well, okay, as far as I can, I'll answer quickly, since there's Evelyn's not
Though,
here.
given the extent to this stuff, I mean, tell us the summary, but I would still love to get
All
the
right, I'll
written
give-
report,
we'll
because
give- we'll-
I can't keep
okay.
track who's on first. But if
We'll
you could give us the
absolutely-
summary.
We'll absolutely give you a brief update. Carolyn Gonat has accepted the position of Chief Executive Officer for the Utah Transit Authority in Salt Lake City, Utah, which is a great opportunity for her. We are very proud of the fact that she is moving on. Carolyn previously was in charge of the construction and planning divisions. At this point, she is still here, so she is still fulfilling those roles. As Scott had indicated, it is most likely that upon her departure, he will be filling the planning role, and I would be someone from the construction department will be filling that role unless and until somebody is hired to make that replacement. Jim Unitas has also accepted a well-deserved retirement. Jim had over 30 years with VTA. He was congratulated by the board at the last meeting. And Jim has not quite embraced the concept of retirement. He is currently a contractor for Kimley Horn, which does a lot of subcontracting work for VTA. At that point, that's really all I know, and we'll be happy to provide you further information as it becomes available.
Thank you. Yes, that's always, we need to be able to know who to contact, and so a lot of
Right.
changes are coming our way. Okay. Roland LeBron would like to speak on item 4. You have 2 minutes. Do we have a timer, actually? You do? Okay.
Yeah, there's a timer here. It's not working. So, I'm going to give you my 2 cents. Chris Augenstein is probably the best thing that's ever happened to VTA planning, because that individual is singularly responsible for this catastrophic planning in the last 20 years. Caroline Gonat, some of you may know, I've been waiting for the VTA to announce that BART will not start revenue service before the end of the year. And that day, I was ready to ask for a resignation. But it's not just that. The next grand jury report will be examining what happened to BART and how phase 1 ended up being over $1 billion over budget. Thank you.
Okay. Seeing no other public comment, we will go down the consent agenda. These items will be voted all as one unless there is anybody on the board would like to pull an item or anybody from the public would like to pull an item.
Motion to approve consent?
We have a motion. Do we have a second? Second. All in favor? Oh, I'm sorry. Any discussion?
Just very briefly, I think we've discussed the reasons why light rail is not a good choice for this corridor. I've received no further correspondence from anybody as an advocate of light rail that we ought to consider it. I am frankly disheartened that the full board is continuing to plow ahead with light rail to East Ridge, given the economics. The grand jury report does clearly call it out, and so I'm just noting that I think we would make a good decision by cutting it as one of the options, even though coming in I was an advocate to do so, but I've been persuaded by compelling evidence that we need a different solution that's more cost effective for this corridor.
Okay. Just a quick note, I think the report was very effective, efficient, and thorough, and I appreciate that. That was well written. Okay. With no further discussion, we'll have a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, motion passes unanimously. Okay, we will be now going on to our regular agenda. The 2 items that we do have are informational items, and so we will just be given guidance and listening today. If there is no formal vote. And the way we will do it, we will have staff give their presentations. We will take public comment after the staff presentation, and then we will bring it back to the board for discussion. So, please, Birgit.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. Before we dive into this item, I want to give a brief reminder to the PAB and to the audience of where we are in this study process. We have completed the first phase of the study, which was the transit market analysis. We are currently in the second phase, which is selecting a series of project alternatives to evaluate in the third phase, which will be an alternatives analysis. That alternatives analysis is a deep dive into projecting capital and operating costs, ridership projections, looking into engineering and other feasibility issues with constructing whatever project or each of these alternatives would be. The product will be a report, and they will feature a matrix that compares all of the different alternatives for their various positives and negatives and allow the Policy Advisory Board to make an informed recommendation to the Board of Directors about how to proceed on this project. So this presentation is about input that I received from city staff. If you'll recall, at our last meeting in April, we invited city staff to participate. We had more discussion than we had time here for that meeting, and we didn't get to hear from everybody. So at the end of the meeting, we determined that I would go meet with all of the city staff and get their input and bring that back to you today. So that's what this summary is. And I've detailed this in the memo that you have in front of you, but these were the big issues that I'd like to call out verbally here. Most cities felt that any changes to the corridor that would result in private property impacts were very perilous for a project. Some cities told me that this is a no-go zone. Other cities said they'd be willing to listen and see what the potential impacts could be if freeway widening needed to occur, although they would wait and reserve judgment on what they would support until after understanding the extent of the impacts. One comment that I received, and this is echoed in a letter that I believe you have from the mayor of Cupertino, was that a concern about losing city planning authority if a new transit line were constructed along the corridor. This comes from concerns that state legislation that is seeking to weaken city land use authority in capping densities or building heights or setbacks or setting parking minimums is undermining the extent to which housing construction can occur in cities. And the legislation is sought to weaken or remove cities' ability to enforce those design elements in areas that are near transit stations. So the establishing of a new transit route in a city is cause for concern for some of the city staff that I talked to. They felt that their councils would be concerned about that. I also heard several comments about equity. There's always been a concern about equity when it comes to express lanes, but a new concern that I heard was about who would be able to use the transit lane. If it's something that may have or be exclusively used by private shuttles, there was a concern about whether that was the right way to expend public funds to have not everybody have access to the lane. Also heard a debate about transit versus car solutions. The transit argument, which has been stated by members of this PAB, is that if you construct a new lane and give it over to vehicles, it becomes politically impossible to get it back. And by making that lane fast and reliable, you can incentivize more people to travel by those space-efficient modes like transit. The other side of the argument is the car argument, which is that given the nature of Highway 85, we're likely to achieve those fast transit speeds in the transit lane, but it would not be at the maximum capacity of person throughput that that lane could offer. And the folks who are in that camp also echoed the next comment, which is that they had concerns about cut-through traffic on city streets due to Highway 85 being over-congested. And they felt that a way to add additional capacity on Highway 85 for vehicles could help with local street congestion. There were also differing opinions about private shuttles. Some cities were concerned that if we install a transit-only lane, that it would induce more shuttle travel along the corridor, and the places where those shuttles stop off corridor could result in more traffic, more parking impacts, and perhaps a condition that local residents would object to. Other cities felt that this is something that's manageable between the city staff and the transit, or the companies that operate transit. And lastly, many staff asked if this money for this corridor, $350 million over 30 years, could be used for other projects, ways of improving access to Highway 85, improving overpasses, or adding direct HOV connectors to the Highway 85 HOV lanes. I just include this as a reminder that while a transit lane is our focus, this pot of money is eligible for noise mitigation as well as other congestion relief projects, and city staff are thinking creatively about how to fund their other priorities along the corridor. So as I've been taking this input from 24 members, I think, of city staff and talking with about 10 policy advisory board members, I recognize that not everybody has a uniform idea, uniform vision for what this project should be. So if there are elements of things that I heard from the cities that the policy advisory board would like to agree with or disagree with or have a discussion about, that would be very helpful for staff as we move forward with this project. So I'll go back to the last slide and ask if there's anything staff would like to, or the PAB would like to add here.
Okay, so at this point, we're going to go for any public input. I have received no cards, so we will close public input, and we will go to the board for comments and discussion. Yes, Mr. Vice Chair.
Just an initial comment on something that I felt that was somehow lost. When we did the Envision process, there was a lot of discussion about the existing express lane option, and it was noted at that time that stopping at 280 on any widening, moving north, stopping at 280, and not figuring out how to improve capacity between 280 and 101 on the north side should be pretty much a non-starter, because it was going to cause all sorts of bottlenecks and congestions. And that became one of the premises that we kind of worked with some of the Envision stuff. Jeannie was involved in that. It's also echoed in the latest letter from the mayor of Cupertino. I didn't see it any place in any of these notes. I don't know if it's now implied that if we do something, it's going to improve capacity along the whole corridor, or if somehow there's still an option that says let's improve 87 to 280, but not 280 to 101 north. So I just want to make sure we haven't lost that.
I think that will come up on the next item. Are there alternatives
I understand that, but in terms of concerns that were raised,
from cities?
it's on that same level, so I'm kind of wondering.
Rod?
I couldn't agree more. In talking about, in characterizing my city's response, you talk about having concerns. Of course, we all have concerns about state law, but honestly, my letter, the letter from the city of Cupertino, particularly on the second page, enumerates a transit vision for this corridor, not a car vision. I don't understand which cities, I'd like to know which cities are interested in pursuing a car-based solution. We know that, well, you can tell me, an express lane, when operating at speed, can handle how many vehicles an hour? Is it 1,500 something?
At the optimal speeds, about 35 to 40 miles per hour.
Yes.
Lane can accommodate about 2,000 vehicles per hour.
Okay.
So a general purpose lane would be about 2,000 people moving. In
Right.
a carpool lane, we're expecting more people per car than the general use lane. The extent to which that occurs, to which shuttles can improve that number, could get that number up to 3,000, 3,500.
So let there be no doubt that the letter from Cupertino and the position of my city council and staff is to be supportive of a transit lane that goes all the way through to Mountain View. As Howard has just mentioned, were we to accept one of these no project alternatives, which really isn't that at all, it would be putting down the express lanes that 3 cities sued to get VTA to stop several years ago. All we'd end up with is a big bottleneck right out here, and that's not going to help flow. We've got to get people moving all the way up to Mountain View. If we can't do that, I don't see I can't imagine that we're doing anything effective. I understand the cut-through traffic on our streets, but the answer surely can't be to make some very small incremental movement in car carrying capacity. Can you tell me more about the debate on equity?
As I was relaying to city staff the discussions we've had at the policy advisory board level and talking about VTA's current financial situation regarding operating funding and the land uses along the corridor and their level of transit supportiveness, it did not seem like VTA would be able to operate much service, if at all, in this corridor, at which point the private shuttles become perhaps the majority users or the entire users of this lane.
Yes.
And there is concern about whether that is the right direction for this project.
So I appreciate that thought. I think what we have to understand is if we put a Lexus lane in, that's going to benefit the people that have lots of money. If we only build a lane for private shuttles, it benefits the people that have the luxury of taking a bus, working for major employers. If we, on the other hand, find a means of having those private employers, through their use of that lane, subsidize a public service. I mean, the real challenge we're facing is our teachers, our construction workers, our city staff, our public employees, people that work at small tech companies, don't have the luxury of taking a bus today up this corridor. And all of our cities are impacted by this. They're impacted because our teachers are saying, you know what? I live down in Morgan Hill. I'm going to just take a job down there, and I'm no longer willing, I can't stand to commute from where I can afford to live. So I think our failure of vision here would be to recognize that, yes, there's an issue of equity, but we do need to create transit in the West Valley. Thank you.
Bruins?
So I don't disagree with a lot of what's already been said, but right now, the first thing, I would like to see the actual, the cities you talk to and exactly which comments come from which cities, okay? You know, the thing is VTA is supposed to be the experts on moving people, okay, and dealing with all of that. Our local staff, with very few exceptions, don't operate with departments of transportation, okay, where in a department of transportation, such as what my colleague to my left here has at his disposal in his city, I would say they've got expertise as well. The rest of us, and it's no slam, even on my own staff or anybody else's staff, this is, we play in the sandbox because we have to, but we don't necessarily have true expertise. And expertise usually comes from shared mindsets, leveraging, you know, a lot of great thinking and such versus having, you know, one person who happens to be labeled as the transportation manager. So I'd like to really see exactly what people are, what the exact inputs that we got. We have to have a vision, as Mr. Sinks has said, and try to figure this out. And human nature says, okay, even if I were one of these staff people who got interviewed, you know, and even as a council member, human nature is, it is so much easier to come up with the 99 zillion reasons not to do something than to start thinking about what we can be doing and that cause and effect. So this will all wash out in phase 3 as long as we pick the right inputs into phase 3. Okay, so in the terms like the widening of the freeways, here's a very specific example. I don't know from your staff report, are these all the way up and down the corridor, or is this what you heard once we got to 280 north to Mountain View, where there is very little public right-of-way that exists, or is this something that is down south of 280 as well?
This comment was universal. Every city I spoke to felt that their councils would be hesitant to engage in any sort of project, or to support any sort of project that would take private property. And they noted that most of the parcels that are adjacent to the freeway are residential parcels. So it would be several little parcels taking backyards, that sort of impact. The extent to which that impact would occur would, of course, depend on the project design and where that extra space could be needed.
And where did they get the idea that that's what this project would entail?
I think we gave them a realistic expectation that some of the project elements, if we need to squeeze in a lane in a narrow portion of the corridor, if we need to create enough space in the median for an inline station, that those could be actual impacts.
We
Okay.
did a right-of-way analysis 2 years ago that did show there could be some impacts north of 280. So that
North of
data's-
280, I
that-
understand.
That data's already there.
I understand the north of 280. What I'm trying to figure out is why anybody south of 280
Would care?
is not that they would, I mean, you would care, but why would this even be on their radar? Something, again, it's so easy to get up with the 99 zillion reasons. So, if we're saying, hey, this is a real potential, well, then why are we bothering with phase 3? Okay, so, we kind of start, these big projects are very hard. They're very hard to manage, and this is not a slam on VTA at all, and please don't take it that way, but we start setting the mindset early on when we start imposing all these, well, this could be a problem, this could be a problem, this could be a problem, because then everybody's going to find their favorite problem and say, I'm not supportive of this. And I think what we really need to understand is, and what we really wanted from staff, and I'm going to tell you what I don't want from staff, so I'm kind of curious as to who was spoken to in my city, is staff's job should not be about guessing what the electeds' positions are going to be. The elected positions change every time there's an election, okay? So they should be looking at it from their professional point of view, and it's fair to say, this may end up being a tough sell, but I think this is the right thing to do. But if all we did was saying, if the conversations was more about read the minds of your elected officials, then I would say this exercise failed, okay? So I do have a lot of concerns in terms of how we went about this and what we really got out of staff. Is it their professional opinions? Is it their anticipation of what a current council might look like? And I can tell you this project is going to go beyond this current council for any of our cities. So, this was great input, but I just think we have to watch how much credence we give to this depending on what we present to a staff person. What is it they're reacting to?
Board Member Camus.
Got it. Okay. Is it working? Yeah. Okay. Well, I also concur with Jeannie. Don't understand why anybody in there's an existing lane all the way to 280. I mean, existing space for a lane. I could see where the concerns would come from north of the 280. I could see where that concern would be. And in that respect, I think we have to look at those concerns. I also concur with Rod on one point, which is we do need to look at the, not creating a bottleneck, although I think we are working on the intersection of 280 and 85 interchange to help with that bottleneck, which I think will solve some of the problems. But I also want us to look at potentially, in Europe they have thinner lanes, if you will. They're like skinnier lanes.
They have smaller cars.
Yeah, they have smaller cars, but I understand. But we can, instead of, I think they're like 12 feet wide, right? Maybe we can go to 11 feet wide and look at proposals where we can go to 11 feet wide, maybe squeezing an emergency lane down in the areas of above 280 so that we could try to fit in the commuter lane, the lane without taking property, and so that we can allay some of those concerns. That being said, I'm not very supportive of having a dedicated just bus lane. So this is maybe 3.5 years later. I've been talking about this for longer than that. We spent $1.2 million, and we have the same exact information that we had 3.5 years ago, which I've been advocating for. Let's pave the lane, and quite frankly, this whole equity discussion is kind of, it should be moot. I know that people are calling it a Lexus lane. Yes, let's charge the Lexuses to get out of your way. Let's make the rich people pay to get out of your way. I think there's no more equitable situation than having somebody pay whatever, $1.40 per mile to go and to alleviate the pressure off the rest of the street. I think it's a very equitable situation that they have to pay us more. And it's been working on 237 and other areas where it's been tried. I think we need to get the most bang for our buck if we're going to get the most people through. We need throughput. That's the number one and only thing that we should be looking at. If throughput is why we are in business, getting people from point A to point B, and because we're in charge of congestion relief. That's what we're in charge of. So yes, have it bus. Yes, have it public bus, private bus, and commuter lane, toll lane, whatever it is. But let's just get going here. Like I said, 3 years later, $1.2 million in studies, and we're back to the same thing I said at the dais 3.5 years ago. Let's just get a move on.
Thank you. I appreciate everybody's comments. I concur with almost all of them. Oh, my mic is not staying up. There we go, thanks. I think I've mentioned in the past, as a landscape architect, I've worked on numerous VTA projects, Great Mall Parkway, some of the other ones. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because based on the grand jury report, there's a lot of issues within VTA that have not been addressed. And we're going to move forward with a $350 million construction project without solving a lot of the internal issues within VTA. And I find that very distressing, especially if we've already spent just $1.2 million on 3 years of study to end up back where we are. And I'm really worried about what's going to happen as we move forward in construction and which lane and how much money we have. So that's my first comment. The second is I'm going to address some of the list of city comments here. Regarding cut-through traffic, it's going to be a problem. How much of the $350 million can be spent in addressing that cut-through, whether it's pork chops, one-way arrows, closing street, no left turns during certain hours. The second, going back to kind of what alternatives, 30 years ago, there was a bike lane that was proposed all along the sides of Highway 85. That has dropped a long time ago. There's going to be future changes in transportation and how cars are owned and driven and buses. And we need to be future thinking in this alternative. Yes, we're charged with throughput and congestion relief, but if we can't be effective in our process and learn from our past mistakes, we're going to just be wasting money on this as we go forward. And the last one is about this, going back to the money. If the buses become the main route or the main cars that are using it, and then the station drop-off within the city is an issue, is the money going to be able to go to addressing some of those issues also? Thank you.
Board Member Mason.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. So what I really think you're looking for today is feedback on the city's input. At least that was the next slide that you had up. So I agree with my colleagues that a staff report breaking down feedback by city would be very much appreciated. I think in order to be transparent not only to the residents but to the board members, so we can know which cities have concerns, and that way elected officials from those respective cities can meet with that city staff, as Board Member Bruins put, to be able to communicate with them and understand their concerns. So I would really appreciate at the end of today that a report is to be sent to the board, to this policy advisory board, to break down the input by city. All of the input that's shown is warranted. That if I was a city staff person, that is what I would normally say against regional cooperation, against long-term envisioning, general planning, things like that. It's what you would expect. But we are, like we talk about the housing crisis, as you know, we are in a transit crisis, and we need to act accordingly. So we need to innovate. We need to understand that if right now public transit capacity is not provided by VTA to any expansion in the 85 corridor due to financial circumstances, financial circumstances will change over the next 100 years. This expansion will be there past that. And so what I'm trying to get at is that we can leverage public-private partnerships like Board Member Sink said in terms of financing from these HOV lanes that are using private shuttles, because that takes cars off of our major corridors. That takes pressure off. That is a benefit to the rest of our residents. So when you look at the rest of the world, as you know, they do public-private partnerships in Taiwan, in Tokyo. They operate their transit agencies as public-private partnerships that are subsidized by the government, but also take private investment. And this is a way for us to do that with the current federal system, although, as you know, VTA relies heavily on federal funds. So if VTA is going to have BART, they're going to generate revenue from that. If VTA is looking at land use and transit-oriented development, they're going to benefit from that. That's incoming revenue that you can foresee in the future. So that's just important information for our residents that may be listening or here today to understand, is that, yes, the financial circumstances, according to the grand jury report, are dire, but they will change. And hopefully for the positive if we do our job, right? So for me, I understand these arguments as feedback for you. However, I would disagree with many of them. And for the reasons that all of the board members here have said, that we can use innovative solutions to subsidize public transit. We can take pressure off that will relieve traffic impact on other corridors. Yes, there will be an impact to private property rights along north of 280. Yes, there will be cut through traffic. However, if we do our jobs as cities, we can mitigate that. And the last point I'd just like to say is that all of us wouldn't be up here if we didn't believe that we could do something in this corridor. So I think that should be included in the record in the minutes that, yes, the feedback was taken. However, the board still believes that expansion in this corridor is possible. Thank you.
I'll put my comments on, just give everybody a chance to go around. I sensed a little bit of frustration from Councilmember Bruins, and if I sense right, I totally agree that VTA is a regional entity, and that we as fiduciary people up here need to take responsibility, or our guiding principle should be what's best for the region. And some other people mentioned, well, yes, this is what you would expect from staff. They are not, there are other goals that we're trying to achieve that I don't know were given to the city staffs. That, one, we're trying to do traffic reduction. Two, we're trying to reduce greenhouse gases. Three, we're trying to improve the quality of life by the amount of time spent on them. And our vision is bigger than what the cities are doing. And so when I see this list of caution, or they're not getting what we're trying to achieve, and maybe that's not, we haven't given them that information, or through the board hasn't given that information. But if we achieve our goal of huge input of transit lanes or whatever solution it is, this will solve a lot of these concerns that they had. We are also looking to the future. And we mentioned many times earlier on that we are trying to acquire a right-of-way that will protect us way into the future. We need to determine that in whatever transit mode that we use, we always need to determine that, or get that right-of-way, and that gives us the flexibility and the options to build whatever technology or whatever mode that we come along is available to us. And that's what we've been doing up here at the board, whereas the cities haven't had that part of the discussion. They were looking directly at, well, what's going to do this for at the short term. So I think when you look at this, that's nice. We can incorporate it, and sometimes on some of the information, I think you incorporated a little too much, or that their assumptions weren't fully vetted or acknowledged to them, and that could be part of our fault for not going back to our region and telling them what was going on. But we have to look beyond some of their concerns. And I think what we're doing in our solutions, as we get into the next item, will help address all these issues and help us get to where we want to be. And so I guess, yeah, I agree totally with Board Member Bruins that, yes, it's nice information. It puts a little more context. It does get the community involved, but we need to give them the context so that they better understand what we're trying to achieve. And we'll put that on the board to do some of that. Mr. Sinks?
Yes. So I'll be brief and just echo some of the points that I've heard. I agree we'd like to see comments by city. I completely agree with John that we have a higher mission, and we're actually trying to solve a regional problem here. We, as Mason said, we have a transit crisis. We simply are losing a lot of people who can't afford to live where they work. As much housing as some of us want to build, some of us don't want to build, whatever, right? Despite those conditions, we're going to continue to see, I believe, longer and longer commutes. And we've simply got to make it possible for members of the general public to not have to fight their way through 2 hours of traffic every day each way. And so I think we have to have the vision. As regards what we do to the north of here, you talk about some cities having objection about takings. You know, this slide just looks like a bunch of red flags to me. As Jeannie said, right? Is it not possible to do this without a taking? Could we not elevate? Jim Bell told me several years ago, he said, don't be afraid to propose solutions that might elevate things, right? Maybe in places where it's very narrow, a small stretch of these many, many miles, we have to do something different. Maybe the station isn't down in the bottom of the corridor in the median. Maybe it comes up to an overpass, or we've created effectively new real estate by having a bus, say, come up to a platform that extends the bridge along the longitude of the corridor. So I just think, yeah, I'd enforce those points and stop there.
Okay, so that will bring us to the next item, which we will do. Do I hear any other?
May I?
Yes, sir.
If I may, I just wanted to express staff's appreciation for the comments that we've heard this morning. It is very important that we get information from your staff, and this information was provided with a guarantee of anonymity to those people who gave it, so that they would give their frank and honest opinions. So your request is not going to be possible to address. The value of what we have heard today is your willingness to take a leadership role, and that leadership role involves your colleagues on your council, and it involves your staff. And I would encourage you to take the attitude and the direction that you are talking about here to your staff to make sure that, A, we have understood the challenges that exist, because it's important to understand those challenges, and to understand that there is a desire for vision and for innovation to try to address these major problems that you've articulated so very well.
Might I suggest that we see if we could do a second round where staffs know that they're on the record, so.
No, I don't want to say that.
Okay. I would, with respect, Mr. Sinks, I think the staff needs to hear from you.
Okay.
And not from us.
I see. No, I get your point. Thank you.
So I'd like to ask a clarifying question. I don't believe we care which individual, if it was Tom, Dick, or Harry, Sally, Susie, or whatever, okay? Can we just, and I don't even care how many people, whether you talk to one person or whether it was, a team of 3 that you talk to, but can we get an understanding of the various cities, okay? It is without, so anonymity to individuals, yes, anonymity to the cities, I'm not convinced of. What's really tough, and even if you want to put it in this context of the grand jury report and all of this, what's really tough is VTA as an organization does not have land use authority, okay? And so you can change whoever is on the governing board, it doesn't fundamentally change that problem, right? And I do believe, the people who serve on this are passionate about trying to get a solution, okay? And I think the people up here are trying so hard to understand the trade-offs that we have to make, okay? And I think the other thing is I think the people that are up here are all committed to trying to provide leadership within our own jurisdictions. But it's very hard to provide leadership if you're kind of always reacting to something that's already happened. So in this regard, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, Jim, in terms of, we need to be talking to our staffs, but it'd be easier for us to have a conversation with our staffs if we understand, hey, from the city of Los Altos, this is the feedback we got from the city of Los Altos, okay? Because my staff doesn't want to listen to all the concerns that really were not attributed to them, they were attributed to somebody else. I'm wasting their time. So if we can have meaningful conversations, if we can understand, we need some tools. And we're a public agency. Our city employees are public agents. So I would like to ask you right now, can we provide this matrix of feedback without naming individuals, but just the cities?
What I will commit to you is that we will take a look at the feedback that we've got relative to its location along the corridor and do our best to provide you the resources and tools that you need.
Okay. Because I think leadership comes from the people who are sitting up here, and we want to.
And we want to help you.
Yeah, because we're not sitting here for how many years going through and chasing our tails, you
Yes.
know? So we're one team.
Yep.
So thank you.
Yeah, along those lines, you've heard feedback. You sort of summarized, we're the leadership. Go back to the various cities and say, here's a recap of what the elected officials, board members said, this is what we need to do as a vision. And then it elicited input from that to say how we can achieve that vision.
That's right.
And that's good.
You have encapsulated it perfectly.
Do we have any other comments on this particular? Okay, I will close this discussion and we will go to item number 9.
Okay. So this item is the revised slate of alternatives. And I want to start by talking about how I've taken the input that I've heard. And again, noting with the asterisk that this is input received from the committee at large and that there may be different visions, and I want to use this as an opportunity to discuss them. So this presentation comes in 2 parts. After each part, there is a request for the Policy Advisory Board to provide some guidance. When we started this project more than a year ago, we were talking about a number of different goals, things that the Policy Advisory Board members had expressed, things that we had heard at the public meetings that we'd had about the project. I've got them listed here. We were talking about different project elements. We talked about expanding the walk shed with park and rides. The Measure B language includes inline stations. And we're talking about a number of potential users for the lane. And also talking about what the VTA service might be. All of these things were on the table at the very beginning, and based on the feedback that I've received, I think we are removing some of these and coming to a clearer focus for what this project is supposed to be, or what the PAB envisions it being. So I want to take you through how I've narrowed down the possible alternatives here. So our earlier item, eliminating light rail as a considered alternative, that removes the high capacity portion of this graphic. I've heard low impacts to private property, and I've heard an interest in low costs, particularly relating to the high cost of building inline stations. I understand, based on our last conversation, that maybe I've interpreted this too far, but this leads me to think that median stations are likely not going to be prevalent along this corridor, that park and rides along the corridor are not likely to be an element of this project. And in doing that, we reduce the access to people. You can only board a public transit service where there is a stop, and if we're not building them along the freeway, people who will be route adjacent but not necessarily stop adjacent. The PAB has talked about the need to achieve fast speeds in this lane, and to do that by only allowing high-capacity, space-efficient vehicles to use the lane. As a result, I've crossed HOVs and single-occupant vehicles off of the list of potential users for a transit lane. But this also undermines our ability to generate revenue from people buying their way in to the lane, and it reduces our ability to move people, since there would be some capacity underutilized, understanding, though, that the goal of moving people quickly is the desired trade-off. And I've expressed concern about our financial situation, and I've heard comments that have been optimistic about our financial situation in the future. I would like to think that those are correct, and I know that there is interest in looking at large funding measures that might be able to help us operate more service. But absent that appearing, I'm not sure that VTA is going to be able to operate a high quantity of service in this corridor, probably around hourly service in the peak direction on weekdays during the peak period is my estimate of what's probably a reasonable public transit service. And so I've landed at this sort of project definition, that we're valuing moving vehicles that are space efficient quickly, but that those vehicles might be mostly, if not entirely, private shuttles. And so the beneficiaries of this project become the companies that operate those shuttles and the employees that use them. And I want to make sure that this is in line with the PAB's vision for this corridor, or if we've made a mistaken assumption here, to seek some correction. So my next question, does this match your vision?
Okay, that completes your,
That's the first half.
okay, so we will,
Do we have hard copies of your?
I went
We
to
have
the
some in the
back
back.
table and got some.
okay.
Could you do that? Because I think it's easier for us to chicken scratch and, yeah. Thank you.
Beats doodling. Okay. Thank you. So we will now go to public comment on this particular item, and we have, you are finished with your presentation, right, Ann?
The first portion of it.
Oh, there's more. Okay, why don't you complete your presentation, please?
Okay, but I'm pausing now for PAB guidance on this topic.
So wait a second. So Chair, I guess what I'd like to do is to do exactly what staff is asking. So we're going to take this thing in pieces, and let's take public comments at the very end of the whole thing. Can we do that? Or you take public comments before staff even
Seems
presents?
appropriate before we comment on any
Yeah, we would-
particular section to take public comment.
I would,
right?
yeah, I was, okay, so.
But are you going to take public comments 3 times on this one item? That's not going to be
No, we're not going
efficient.
to do that, but how many parts, you have 2 parts to this?
2 parts, and if it would be to your preference, I could just move through the whole thing, and you could take the questions that I have as one discussion.
Yeah,
Okay,
okay. We're
So-
going to go the whole presentation, then we'll come back.
I'll keep moving forward. Note that the alternatives that I'm going to discuss are based on the assumptions in the first half, so we can check those at the end. So we can evaluate different operating plans for any of the alternatives that we come up with when we do our modeling to project the ridership and the impact to throughput along the corridor. I'm recommending that we look at weekday peak period hourly service for VTA transit and also look at a no transit scenario. And this is something that Cupertino had requested of us to build a lane but not operate VTA transit in it, I think relating to the request about concerns over land use authority. And then-
I'm sorry, where in this letter does this appear? I must object.
I think there's references to SB 50 and 330.
Where does it say that we're suggesting that VTA not operate a public bus service in this corridor?
Doesn't it request that one of the scenarios we evaluate look at no service in the transit corridor?
I'd love you to find the paragraph for
Okay,
me.
you could bring that up under, my assumptions are similar, so, well, so finish your report, and then we'll bring back, and Rod, you'll start off the comments then.
Sure. So looking at 2 different scenarios for transit lane users, VTA transit and private shuttles, and then private shuttles only. As sort of additional elements of a project, we are looking at, or VTA is proposing that stations at Stevens Creek and El Camino Real may be warranted. At our last discussion, the feedback I received from the PAB was that the 7, 10, and 14 station alternatives way overestimated the number of stations that would be appropriate for the corridor, and that low or no stations would be worth considering. Stevens Creek has De Anza College, the Oak Shopping Center redevelopment, and the existing sort of unofficial park and ride that occurs there, which makes me think it would be a logical location for a station. El Camino Real is where we observed the highest volume of shuttles when we did our video survey of the corridor. It also has strong transit connections, making me think that that would be a logical place for a transit stop. Mountain View has asked that we look at direct access ramps from the HOV lane to Evelyn Avenue to provide easy access to the Mountain View Transit Center. And Cupertino has requested in their letter that bicycle storage be provided at stations to see if we can expand the travel shed around the station and have a bigger catchment area for potential riders along the corridor, and to look into putting a physical barrier between the transit lane and the adjacent lane. So I've come up with 3 project alternatives. The no project alternative, which would be not implementing a transit lane, but implementing the other project that VTA has been looking at in this corridor, which is an express lane project, and then 2 versions of a transit lane that I'm calling short transit lane and long transit lane. And you have this in your 11 by 17 handout. I'm also going to show similar graphics on the screen here. These graphics are divided into 3 portions. The left third of the page will be the north of 280 section of the corridor that is narrower and has more design constraints about it. The middle third will be I-280 to Highway 87, where there is a wider median, and we expect less impacts, probably no impacts to right-of-way. And the right portion of the page is south of Highway 87, where the light rail exists in the median. This is our current configuration, where we have basically 3 lanes going in each direction the entire way through, with HOV lanes adjacent to the median in effect during the peak periods. The no project alternative would be adding an additional lane in the median, or adjacent to the median in that middle portion of the corridor, and converting the HOV lane that exists into an express lane. The short transit alternative would be a similar construction as the no project, except there would be different rules on that lane adjacent to the median in the middle portion of the corridor, would be our transit lane. And then the long transit lane alternative is looking at extending that northward toward Mountain View, possibly with some impacts to right-of-way, but we'd like to study this to see to the extent those might occur. So there were other alternatives that were suggested at the PAB at the last meeting that we looked into that are not included here. One, which was suggested by Member Miller, was to look at building the bus lane, but also putting an enhanced level of express bus service in there. I expressed the concerns that I have about the VTA's ability to fund that service. So while I like it from someone who designs transit plans and wants as many buses out there as possible, our financial planners would fight me on this one. And the reversible transit lane idea, which had been brought up by Chair McAllister based on an example he'd seen in Boston. We looked into this. We looked into how to build this safely, abiding by Caltrans design requirements. And it seems that where you have access to the reversible lane, you need a good deal of infrastructure relating to merge lanes, including safety barriers around where physical infrastructure exists. And the result is that we end up spending too much physical space on creating those safety barriers that we don't get very much in terms of additional capacity. We might spend more than 30 feet just to get one more lane when we could spend less than that to get 2 lanes in each direction and allow greater flexibility and safer travel between the new lane and the general purpose lanes. Just to illustrate that, an example from San Diego on I-95, the barriers around where the physical infrastructure exists can be about 20 feet, and that concrete barrier prevents flexibility. In this case, it makes sense because they can gain upwards of 4 reversible lanes for that lost infrastructure or lost space for the merge lanes. And just to bring this back to some notes that I talked about at the beginning, the objective of the PAB here is to make an informed recommendation to the board, and it need not be very specific. If we're not certain exactly where every station should be or the design of every station, I think that's okay at this stage. We just need to know the preferred mode, the project boundaries, what the service plan would be, any design elements that should be part of the project, and knowing the project purpose is good because when we get to an environmental phase, we'll have to use that document to explain why the proposed project fulfills that project purpose. And also just to note, we're at the start of this process. Later along, if the board allocates funding to take this into a project status, we'll have the opportunity through the preliminary engineering project phase to do detailed analysis, looking at many more things than we can look at in this stage, and we'll be able to further refine that design through environmental clearance and engineering. So, if you are wanting revisions to these alternatives to suggest additional alternatives or make tweaks to them, I'm happy to refine the slate of alternatives and bring this back to the Policy Advisory Board. I would like to have the Policy Advisory Board take an action at some point to say these are the alternatives that we are settled on, and to say that we're not moving back to consider anything else in the alternatives analysis. If we're happy with what we've come up with today, or today with revisions, I can bring that action item to you the next time and get a jump start on the alternatives analysis with our project team after the conclusion of this meeting. And then later on, we'll do a round of community outreach when our report's finalized, and that'll be the time to make a recommendation to the board of directors. So the second break for discussion, asking if all the alternatives that I've presented cover what you're interested in, or if we should consider others. Comments about station locations, the rules for the lane, and whether we're ready to move into the next stage of the project.
Okay. So I just want to make a couple of comments, is that I didn't agree with a lot of the assumptions in this, and when my turn for comments will come along. So let's be positive, constructive comments on how we're going to approach their assumptions and say this isn't current or so forth, because that's what kind of feedback they're going to give. We are here to give them direction. As Adam said, then this on our agenda, it's not an action item, but we can give direction on that. And I think we're going to have a lot of good discussion on this, because this is probably one of our more critical discussions we're going to have on this whole process.
Chair, if I may, I have one pretty broad question that I would like to ask before you take public comment. May I do that? I promise it won't, no, without going into the weeds. So the question that I have for you, Adam, is you've got 3 alternatives. Is there any reason, is there something that I would be missing? Why just 3 versus what if we wanted to put a 4th one in there? We don't want to go, 10, but if we wanted to do 4, is that a problem?
I don't think 4 is a problem. That's within the bandwidth of our team.
Okay, and the genesis of my question is right now we have something that's called a no project alternative, then the short transit and the long transit, and my thought process is we need something that actually is a no project, which is current configuration, and then the one that's called no project alternative, it's actually not a no project, it is the express lane project. So I kind of would like to delineate those two. From a current configuration is the definition of no project, and express lane is a second project.
I'll note that no project is a bit of a wonky term. It's what we think would happen if we didn't do this project, so we can always add another
I think we'll get some
scenario.
comments on that particular one. You would say there are no items. Okay. Now we will go to the public, and again, we will have Roland LeBron on this item, number 9, and then followed by Steve.
So, as you know, I'm not a politician. I only get 2 minutes, so I'm going to get straight to the point. Trying to get this thing down to the VTA is an exercise in futility. When somebody comments that the VTA experts in moving people, I entirely disagree. Moving people and the VTA is an oxymoron. Now, just go to a specific example here. Right at the front when you're looking at the VTA service, frequent high capacity. I did some calculations, light rail. In the rest of the world, capacity is measured by seats per hour in a specific corridor, period, end of discussion. The light rail would actually have 800 seats per hour. If we were now going to run buses every 30 seconds, the capacity would be 6,000. It'd be 120 by 50. Now, do these buses have to be VTA buses? No. Just provide the infrastructure, and then let's see what comes in. Everybody goes about private shuttles with employers. Ever heard of Flixbus? Do you know what that is?
Sure.
Right. That goes from Caltrain to San Francisco, from Diridan to San Francisco in 1 hour, competes with Baby Bullet. Do they need an operating subsidy? No, they don't. What you have to focus on is to provide the infrastructure. Now, all these alternatives, what you need is managed lanes, not HOV. And then, dependent on what the demand on the infrastructure is, what goes onto the lanes dynamically changes on the fly. It's not a big secret. And how much time do I have left here? Why isn't this? Right. So let me wrap up here. Right now we're talking about blowing $600 million on East Ridge. Do you know what they're going to do to put the stupid island station in the middle? They're going to take out an HOV lane. You know what? Take the $600 million and go and blow it on an elevated structure between 101 and 280, for crying out loud.
Steve Levin.
Thank you. When I served on the Santa Clara County Transportation Commission in the 1980s, representing San Jose, which was the predecessor to VTA, we had a concept that you run buses, you find out where your busy corridors are, and over time, you might do something to improve the infrastructure for those buses. You don't start by building stations and all kinds of other stuff without knowing if you're really going to have the transit usage going down that corridor. Somehow, that concept seemed to have gotten lost in some of the earlier discussions by this PAB. The goal should be to provide transportation facilities and not to promote transit per se. You're a congestion relief agency. Whatever works to relieve congestion is important. And VTA is not just a transit agency. If people want to use private vehicles, so what? I assume most of you tend to drive here. I happen to take a bus to get here today. I doubt very many other people here took a bus to get here today. The future is going to be very different in terms of autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, fuel-efficient vehicles, and you can't really decide now what people are going to need in the future or what's so bad about their vehicles, because they're not going to be that bad. And by the way, there's already transit from south on the 85 corridor south to Mountain View and Sunnyvale industrial areas. There's Caltrain. There's light rail lines serve those areas already. So you don't need to provide more transit to go up the 85 corridor per se. The next network studies show there's so little transit demand that Almaden light rail line is being discontinued. The express bus service throughout the county is being cut back. The 185 that you tried to run up the corridor has been eliminated. But the best solution is just to add more lanes, and I agree with Councilman Camus. We're concerned about throughput, and you just need to have lanes that can be used by buses, whether they be private buses or VTA buses or cars. Thank you.
Thank you. Heidi Owens?
Thank you to the elected officials for your service on the commission. As a member of the public, I really appreciate it. I'm a candidate for Los Gatos Town Council. I'm disappointed to see the town's not represented here. And thank you to staff. You've obviously done a lot of work on this issue, and I can see the challenge in trying to distill all input into feasible projects. I wanted to point out only one logical error, which is you took revenue generation off the chart, and if we're doing private shuttles, that is a revenue opportunity because we could charge for the opportunity for those private shuttles to go back and forth in the express lane. Thank you.
Okay. Do I have any other people wishing to speak on this on a public? Okay, seeing none, I will bring it back to the board. Mr. Sinks, you have the floor.
Yeah, so I want to be sure that Cupertino's input is clear. I sat through these meetings. I helped craft this letter in its draft form.
May I just interrupt you for a second, Mr.
Sure.
Sinks? We have reviewed the letter, and I believe that we misinterpreted a phrase that was in there, and I apologize for that. We'll be happy to go over that with you afterward, but I think it is clear of what Cupertino's position is, and staff does not dispute it.
Thank you.
Thank you for allowing that.
So very briefly, right, I realize number one, it says not for use by public vehicles, but obviously this is cars, right? So what we're really trying to do.
That was the problem.
Yeah. What we're really trying to do is subsidize a public transit service in the corridor. We know VTA is beyond broke, okay? We get it. We get that it's very hard to do anything other than what goes to downtown San Jose. We get all of that. And so we're going to continue to spend money on those projects and starve everything else. So I get it. But I think the vision that we're trying to talk about is, yeah, I mean, sure, if I happen to live in Morgan Hill or Gilroy and I had the option of taking that 185 bus versus taking Caltrain to get to Mountain View, well, I don't think it's much of a contest. It was, you were running a competing service against an established Caltrain service, and time competitive, running at about the same time. There's no surprise to me that 185 didn't get any traction. What we're talking about is connecting the cities on this corridor, right? Which isn't simply the South County. It's people that don't live close to an alignment in Almaden Valley where they could get on public transit today. The people that could, however, get an Uber pool or a Lyft line or whatever's coming in the future from a wider catchment area. That's one of the points of our letter. to a nearby station, if there were a few stations, not a lot, but a few stations, where they could ride a public bus. Teachers, firefighters, the people that service workers, the people that we want in our community. And today, they have just no option. So they're fighting their way through this clogging traffic on the freeway. And yes, when Waze tells them to go someplace else, they go someplace else, which is on our surface streets. But you talk to a lot of people. I talk to a lot of people at my city hall. They would love an option to come up this corridor, have the luxury of coming up on a bus that brought them to and from. And, you know, they'll ride their bike first and last mile, or they'll take an Uber or a Lyft to do that, because that's how frustrating it is. And then a major point of our letter is the idea that we do need a few stations in the corridor to establish this as a transit service. I mean, otherwise it's absolutely something that's a flash in the pan. Who knows if this service is going to be around? The point of having a couple, we said 3 to 5 in our letter, stations, is to really establish that we are building some infrastructure to allow people to connect. And so we think, based on prior data, that this could be done. If we think there's not room at certain pinch points north of here to create the lane widening, then, you know, as I said earlier, I think, you know, we go up or we do something else.
Rod, does it have to be specifically in the corridor, or could it be immediately adjacent to the corridor?
I think, at least as we discussed it in our council, and the position of our council has been, we want the vehicle to keep going. We want it to be able to unload and reload with minimal disruption. So if that means, you know, it's we've created basically another lane as an off-ramp and then an on-ramp again for a station that's at the side of the corridor, right? So be it. But the basic point is, we'd like this thing to operate like the concept I've always heard of BRT, where these things can get off and get on and keep moving quickly. We know that if we have too many stations that inhibit fast service, we're going to have an issue. We know if, because it won't be time competitive, we know if there's nothing whatsoever, that it's going to be hard for those buses to, because after all, I mean, it's going to be hard for people to start at one end of the corridor and get anywhere along it to another. And we, you know, my council specifically, again, is looking at, as Council Member Fong said, looking at a public-private partnership. You talked about some cities. I know Denver did this as well. Explore bringing corporations into the process to provide partial funding for such a guideway in exchange for future fee offsets. We think it's appropriate that you know, these major corporations that are getting the advantage of this very valuable real estate contribute to a public, to the facility and public service in some way. But we firmly believe that it's high time for us to create a public transit service in this corridor that gives a real advantage to the people who are stuck and sick of their commute and look over there and see that bus flying along and say, hey, that could be me. We think it's time for Silicon Valley to grow up. Thank you.
I'd just like to remind the board that we do have 2 questions, and you could be incorporating them into your comments. Does the, you know, as the earlier part of the discussion, does this match the PAB vision? And then the alternatives meet what we're trying to accomplish. So if you want to attack both those questions at one time, that's up to you, but just remember we have those 2 questions from the board. Board Member Camus.
Thank you. And I appreciate the comments from the public, especially from the candidate in Los Gatos, who I think accurately said that we can get money from the people who are using the lanes for their buses, like FlexBus or whatever from Google or whoever else is using the lanes. Do these alternatives cover all desired ideas. I don't know that you're going to cover all desired ideas, but my thinking is everybody here seems to have a consensus about going the long transit lane alternative. We definitely want to look at throughput all the way to 101. So I think we can eliminate a lot of other options that, at least this is what I think that everybody's wanting to go. We all want to look at going all the way to 101. And I concur with that sentiment wholeheartedly. Are the station locations acceptable? I don't care if, I don't want any station, personally, I don't want any stations on there, especially if you can only go in the morning and in the afternoon. It's a waste of money and it will take a lot more time and cause a whole lot of design complications that are unnecessary for now. As somebody else from the public said, there are options. I think industry is ahead of us, quite frankly. And on the bus services, we're unsubsidized now. On electric cars, we're testing out autonomous cars. So there's all kinds of alternatives that are happening that I think just get us a lane and then let the chips fall where they may later on. If we have a huge, overwhelming need, we can always add these things. Who is allowed to use the transit lane? I would like to see the transit lane be able to be used by public buses, private buses, and people who will pay to get out of your way. This is my personal thinking, because it's working everywhere else. Next step, I'm excited about the idea of going north of 280. I know that our colleagues are really concerned about the bottleneck, and I concur with them. I think that we should look at this, and I said I'm hoping that we could look at going to 11 feet and potentially using one emergency lane to supplement the need for the additional lane, so that we don't have any takings requirements or any any need to go sky high or add huge expenses to this project. So my direction would be long transit lane. Let's look at different width of the lanes so that we could squeeze in that fourth lane without adding too much cost, and then open this up to express lane, because it will pay for itself over time, and we can answer equity by saying that the rich people will get out of your way. If we do just the bus lanes and we only allow those companies, that will be a true elite lane, in my opinion, because it'll only allow Google and those big busing companies that can afford shuttle service. That will make this the elite lane. That's the only way I think it will be an elite lane, is if we only make it for private buses. All the other alternatives, I think, are good. I just don't think that we should provide a lane for just those private buses. I don't think that the public buses are a good idea. To have that dedicated lane for one bus or two buses per hour in peak times, I think it's a waste of money. So the only alternative that I see is the express lane model. We could always take away the expressway model in the future if we have a huge influx of buses, and we can make it a bus lane later on if we have the ridership. So that's the guidance. And I also want to thank the public for all their comments. I could tell you that BRT in San Jose isn't working that well, Rod. It is a horrible slowdown on Santa Clara Street.
Is that the Alum Rock one?
Yeah, the Alum Rock extension. It's not working that well. And you guys are lucky because you guys protested against it going down Stevens Creek. El Camino. You guys protested, you won. Probably a good idea, because it actually took away, it takes away 2 lanes, and and the amount of throughput is not significant. And so I don't like the idea of BRT because we know that it doesn't work for sure. Just come to San Jose and go down Alum Rock.
Well, Johnny, I mean, it works many places in the country and the world.
It doesn't
If I
work in
may,
San Jose.
It also works pretty well in the area you're referring to. And if I may, it is one of the very rare spots in public transit today where we've seen an increase in ridership.
That ridership, the 522 was already fantastic. The bus 22 and 522.
I'm talking about improvement.
Yeah, and it was an improvement for that bus lane, true. But it sits empty a large portion of the time. It only has the one bus.
I realize the whole network has low ridership, okay?
Yeah.
But I think to say that BRT is not an effective solution is...
Well,
I'm not buying that part of your argument.
Well, look, if we're talking about throughput, take a look at what we're happening in BRT, and that's the best case scenario, and then equate to how much ridership do we have on BRT? This is the best bus lane on VTA. How many people do we take from point A to point B on BRT, on bus route 522?
I don't know the exact
hour.
numbers, but we're in the range of about 6,000 daily riders for the entire route.
Okay, so let's say the peak hours. Let's give it the best case scenario. What is the peak hour on BRT? So 6,000 the entire day. You wanted to. So what is it? What is it for the peak hours? 1,000? Would 1,000 be?
I don't know the route profile that closely to know when it's in its highest demand.
Okay. We're talking about having a lane that can transport 3,000 people per hour. This is transporting
A lane that can transport 3,000 cars?
people per hour. If you're looking at the alternatives here, he said the commuter lane, the express lane could potentially carry up to 3,000 people per hour, and this dedicated bus lane is only carrying. I'm saying 1,000 is, if it's fair, maybe 1,500 would be extreme, I think, per hour. If you're looking at 6,000 riders per day, it doesn't pencil out to do a BRT lane. And so this is my concern. I think we need to make the lane, and I agree with going to the long transit lane, and it should be open to express lane. In the future, we can actually take this lane and turn it to a BRT lane. It gives us flexibility if we decide that this is the way to go. And so, but to go forward with this idea and give staff, that would be my recommendation, is the long transit lane, looking at it as a express lane.
Okay. Now, it was asked of me to make sure that we potentially, there's two questions. Well, one's a longer one. Staff supports, seeks PAB guidance on city staff. Oops, sorry, wrong one. I get to the right one. Match the PMB vision. So that's one that had all the charts on it and so forth like that. So do you have any thoughts on that? Does it match the vision? With the one, could we bring up those charts, please?
Sure. I believe Member Camus did express a preference on whether it should be limited to just private shuttles or not. I have that
Okay,
in my
go
notes.
back more, not that, but bring back your, there you go. And so the ones that are highlighted, fast speed, private shuttle, these are your assumptions.
This is the direction that I think the vision is moved based on the collective feedback, and I'm requesting feedback on whether I have this correct.
Okay. So I will give you a moment if you wanted to think about that, and we'll come back to you, or you pretty well felt that your thoughts have been conveyed?
My thoughts are, again, move people would have been my goal. I want to move people from point A to point B. So
That's clear.
We have that. It's never been, Anyway, that's always the way it's been. Whether it's fast speed or medium speed, I think that goes along to say. And private shuttles, I think we should include private shuttles. I think we should include private shuttles, VTA, and HOV lanes. So I think as far as users are concerned, let's include. Ooh, this is a cool screen. You people in Cupertino living it up. So we should use the entire capability of what users. I open it up to all users. That's the democratic way. So
Okay.
that's it.
Okay. Mr. Sinks, would you like to comment on this particular screen, please? And then
Surely.
everybody else, we're going to concentrate on this screen first, and then we'll go on to the
Right.
alternatives afterwards.
So I agree with Johnny, we should move people. I think we should have median stations. I'm okay with the idea that, park and rides, if they exist, could be provided by cities or projects along the corridor, but that not be the focus of limited public monies. Of course, I agree again that VTA Transit is the part of this. I mean, frankly, it is the part of this that I think is essential. If we can't get decent VTA service or we want to supplement it, we in Cupertino are now going to experiment with a solution where we have on-demand service up to Caltrain station. And I think, shuttles that any public agencies run, but the backbone here is VTA. We may supplement what you do, but we think that VTA transit service in this corridor is vital to moving the people I talked about earlier. Frequent service, I would say, once an hour isn't going to really cut it, right? I think at peak hours, we ought to be running buses much more frequently up the corridor. And your skepticism in the prior slide comes from saying, well, we don't have the money, but I think we get the money by inducing those who would use this lane, the private users, not the government agencies, to compensate for this so that we can afford to subsidize the service, so we can establish ridership and hopefully eventually, right, have lots of we can actually have frequent service, not only for the corporate users, but for the general public. And then, yes, access to many. I think we ought to take it in mind that there's a wide catchment through here. We're not expecting that we're only going to gather people who live a quarter mile from any one of these very infrequent stations. We're going to have, people coming either by bike or by a private Lyft, Uber, something like that. So, yeah, that's what I would do with this chart.
Question for staff. So Rod put up peak hours. Is that under your frequency, or could that be a third box?
Usually when we think of frequent service, I'm thinking of an all-day type model. The nature of this transit market would be peak period and directional. So frequencies would really just be in the one direction, how many vehicles per hour are going up.
And
I guess
it's just clear.
Yeah.
So could we have a third box, or would that be appropriate to put peak hours directional?
I'm assuming this is peak hour and directional already.
Okay.
So, Caltrain does it too, right? They're running a lot more trains during the commute hours. They have then one every hour or something like that. I think that would be a model that, I'd like to see. And we get enough funding from these private shuttles to offset the cost.
So should private funding suffice to cover the cost of operations, you're interested in seeing a service that doesn't just run in the peak period, but would run at a lower frequency at other times of day?
Yes, I think we should have an occasional service during the day, but I think the primary market that we're trying to satisfy is commuters. I'd like to see us go make a deal with these private companies, as has been done right on 101 and maybe done over Dumbarton Bridge. I'd like to go make a deal with these folks to help us supplement what we got on Measure B to fund the infrastructure we need to do this, and then get on with strike an agreement where we can get a public bus service that's subsidized. Thank you.
Susan?
Yes, thank you. Let me make sure I understand. There's 4 questions at the end, and there's this, right, so right now, we're just trading on the, let's, thing went away there.
Gotcha.
Right. Okay, so then the 4 questions at the end, we're gonna do a second round. Okay, great. Okay, so I gotta rethink what I was gonna say here. Okay, under users, the 4 that are listed, private shuttles, does that just mean these corporate buses? Because as made, Mr. Sinks has made comments about the Uber Lyft connections and ride sharing. So I just did a little quick math here. If we spent $7 a day by 6,000 people, we'd spend $21,000 a day at 260 work days a year. We would only spend $5.5 million to basically pay Uber guys or whoever $7 each person a day to get those from the outlying parts of a city onto 85. And so I would like, I don't know if it's redefining private shuttles or adding about the users could be these ride shares and Uber, Lyft type of stuff. Regarding the median stations and the park and rides, how many, there was a discussion of whether it's 3 to 5 and or where. So that would be, I don't know if that adds another category or just keeps it straight under median stations. I agree with the goal. Moving people and generating revenue to me are the 2 highest priorities, and under move people, access to many actually should be up right under move people instead of down at the bottom of the goal list. And then I'll come back with my other comments.
Really quickly, I just think it's just important to note that the vision could be short-term or long-term. And that's when this is being communicated to the board of directors eventually, that's very important to note. So a lot of this, there's a lot of variables that I think I wouldn't knock out any of this, because if we do end up having a public-private partnership, that you would want to ask corporations, do you want a median station? Rather than picking up individuals in the neighborhoods, would it be better if cities directed their services to provide for a central location station? And that would define the business model. So I can't necessarily rule out median stations because I don't know what the private side would want in a desired agreement. I can't rule out park and rides because park and rides might be crucial to a median station. I can't rule out VTA transit, I can't rule out frequent, I can't rule out high capacity, because if they're able to subsidize a public program, whether it's an actual bus or similar to a VTA Next Network program, where we could have some kind of rideshare app, that is to me defining of the vision. So I think the lens that we're looking at this is not the right lens, to put it frankly. But if we're saying the grand vision is that in 100 years, we'd be able to have all of these great, but in the next 10 years that we're focusing on fast speed and private shuttles, that would be a different conversation. So if we're focusing on short time, yes, I get it. We don't have money. We should focus on the fast speeds, the private shuttles, maybe in the 25-year plan, look at a possibility of a public-private partnership once we prove our concept that we've expanded the corridor to have a long transit line. So I think whatever this policy advisory board comes up with, we really need to distinguish whether it's a short-term vision, a medium-term vision, how long year-wise, and whether it's a long-term vision. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation. Thank you. For right now, if it's a 5-year, 10-year vision, I would say fast speeds, private shuttles, a long transit line versus a short, but noting that there's the possibility that this could all happen in the future, depending on those variables of whether the private side says we would want to invest in this.
Thank you. Board Director Bruins.
Okay. you talk about the vision here. I agree in terms of short-term, long-term. So, but you know what? When I look at this, what I really am wanting is to get to a rapid development, okay? And I think, you know, you kind of set your sights on what we can do short-term with a long-term view of expandable. And I will go through each one of these, but before I do, I mean, look at some existing things out there. If you look at Caltrain, okay? Caltrain's service wasn't dual, equal, back and forth. It was one direction in the morning and a different direction at night. Over time, as land use patterns change, we are getting to the point where it has equalized in terms of both directions, okay? So, you know, so there's models out there, there's things out there that if we understand and you look back, you can see and have hope for what you can have ahead of you. If you look at the private shuttles, it's a similar kind of thing. They don't travel all over heaven and earth and such. They've got, you know, they make as few stops as possible to get to where they have, and they use you call it catchment areas, okay? They use VTA sites and such. So we know that there's models where you have people who go to a collection point and hop on. That collection point is functional. It fills up that friggin' shuttle, so that shuttle is doing one long trip from point A to point B. It's not point A to B to Z, you know. So that's my mindset, okay? This is where I look at in terms of the design center for me. So, and then the other thing before I make comment on each one of these is I would caution all of us to understand express lanes. When we use something like 237, not a valid example in my humble opinion. If you look at what's happening on 101, okay, to make the express lanes work, it won't work with what we have right now, which is 2 or more vehicles. It's got to be up to 3 automatically to even get into this. And so as you build more roadway and you make it more accessible to cars and you look at the greatest potential for massive housing happening in South County, okay, if everybody's in cars, we're going to be right back to where we are today in no time at all, okay? So, anyway, so with all of that, in terms of the vision, when I look at this, I will say in terms of the goals, it's move people, it's fast speeds. The revenue generation, I do not like the term revenue generation because that's biased. So the question becomes, there's different ways to deal with this, and one is like looking at public-private partnerships, looking at other funding models. So do I want this to cost VTA, and after chairing the financial stability, do I want us to dig the hole deeper? No. So do I want it to be more cost neutral by looking outside of just revenue? Yes. So calling it revenue bothers me, but I think the goal needs to be something closer to being somewhat cost neutral, or it can't cost us any more. So that might mean looking at pricing this as premium services, you know, particularly if you look at it's the shuttle bus for the rest of us, is the VTA transit one, as well as public-private partnerships. So I would like to see in our goals some statement regarding the dollar element. So I kind of agree, I think in theory, with what the one individual who's running for Los Gatos City Council mentions. We got to have dollars in here. And then in terms of, I'm going to jump over to users. I mean, this one's kind of hard because I'm not sure what we're talking about, particularly when we get to the next piece of this. So for me, I do want to look at, if you look at 2 lanes, okay, and that's the conversion of the HOV, which I think is not up for debate by this body at all. So if you've given that, the question is, what do you do with the additional lane? So for me, so when we say users, if we look at the entire program, yes, the conversion of existing HOV is definitely the bottom 2, the HOV and SOVs with fees, okay? So that's still part of the thing, okay? But when we look at this additional lane or additional, you know, what do we do with this additional real estate or the creation that we have or that we're going to create? I think it has to be transit, okay? And whether you want to say VTA transit or just say transit, I don't care, but it's got to be transit and it's got to be private shuttles. And again, you know, in my mind, it is the shuttle for the rest of us, right? So I think both of those need to stay in part of the vision, because otherwise we're never going to get ahead of this, and we're always going to be complaining, and grand jury reports will be written years and years and years and years to come about how we have ineffective transit. If you don't design it for transit, it doesn't happen after the fact, okay? In terms of VTA service, I think that one, it's really, I mean, short term, it's really designing for peak periods and trying to move as many people as we can in peak periods over a sustainable period of time, not for, you know, the 2 years because you've thrown automobiles in there. Sorry, Gianni, but this is where you and I will diverge in our approach on this. Now, when it comes to the elements, which we are really talking about where we are collecting people, whether it's actually a station or whether it's a park and ride and all like that, for me, the vision, if I were to say, what do I want to look at the short term, the minimal number of things we need, whether it's park and ride or what have you. And not, I don't care if it's a median station, I don't care if it's an off-site station, I don't care if it's a park and ride. I think what I really would like is to understand and going into this with the philosophy of minimum in terms of at the start, but knowing whatever we come up with is going to be expandable over time. And again, I will go back to a Caltrain example. Caltrain has, you know, initial operation, we had umpteen stations all the way from San Jose all the way up to San Francisco. And how did we get more capacity? Is we ended up with the baby bullet. So I wanted us to start with a design that's more equivalent to the baby bullet. If you could only put a handful of points in, where would you put those? And then be able to expand future in terms of the long term. I think, because when we start this, I fundamentally believe where we have bigger riderships and such, whether it's our buses, if you look at the 22, and let's just call it the El Camino Real corridor, we move a lot of people, but a lot of people move a long distance. If you look at Caltrain, they're moving long distance. When you look at the private shuttles, they're moving long distance. So I think it's a design flaw for us to start with thinking you have to have 90 zillion micro catch points versus saying, let's go for something macro, let's build the capacity, let's then let it evolve. So that's my 2 cents on the vision. Plus.
Vice Chair.
So we got to get back to the data, and I'm going to ask staff to redistribute some of the data that we already have. So when you look at the picture, right, we have 1.9 million trips that happen in our county between the 40-something zones that you guys broke up the data into. That came from cell phone data. Be good if we could redistribute that data. The reason I want to bring up the 1.9 million trips, the entire VTA transit system has 120,000 daily boardings against 1.9 million trips. I know, but let's pick Portland. Portland's 300,000 daily boardings. It's multi-county. Again, it's against 1.9 million trips. Let's throw BART in there. BART's peak day is 447. Their average is 432,000 boardings per day. Again, against 1.9 million trips just within our county. Let's talk about Highway 85, the corridor that we're trying to figure out a plan for. If we could get staff to re-provide the spaghetti diagram that showed who's going from which exit to where, I want to remind this group, we continue to make this ad hominem false argument about providing transit for people from Gilroy and Morgan Hill when we know that just before Fremont there's 120,000 vehicles cross a day, but we know that there's only 6,000 that make the trip from south of the 85-101 connection up to the 101 connection on the other side. We're looking at less than 5% of the people out on that corridor are these people making this full long trip. We have this data. For us to say, oh, we're going to do all this because there's going to be such rapid growth down in the South County for housing, and that all these people are clogging Highway 85 that are traveling that distance, the facts do not support that. We have all the data. So I would really appreciate it if we could redistribute the facts, the data, because there's a lot more new people up here who haven't looked at that data. So what other points do I have on data that are interesting? Oh, yeah, corporate shuttles. It's a couple of years ago, but they said that was 30,000 riders a day Bay Area wide. Okay, we know that that's the only significant growth in transit ridership in the entire Bay Area. And I believe about 10,000 of that is focused in our county. So again, do we have real data? We actually counted buses, so we have some sense. And for those of us who've been on the other side, and it's been noted up here, those companies tend to run those buses pretty darn near full. And many of the companies have introduced double-decker buses. So you're gonna have to change your data in the back because you gotta multiply by a bigger number. So looking at the data, the numbers of people, one lane on that freeway in Saratoga is equal to 33,000 vehicles a day at Saratoga Avenue. I get it, up at Fremont it's worth a little bit more, but those who cross Saratoga Avenue. So anything that we do has to be compared to 33,000. We can't put a solution out that carries a few thousand and say we've done a great job. I don't want to pick on East Ridge, but I got to pile on with everybody else. They're going to take out a lane, which is carrying 20-something thousand people a lane, and then 20,000 something people per lane, and they're going to pick up a few hundred riders. This is not a moving solution. They're actually eliminating the possibility of people moving around, okay? We can't make stupid mistakes on 85. We get one shot at making this right now. I don't believe it's a 100-year solution, but it's 50 years, right? It's a long-term kind of thing, and we really, really should focus on getting it right. So on the chart, which is what John's asked me to focus on, he's kicking me under the dais here, you can't tell, but I believe that we need to talk about moving people. I believe that this generation of revenue, somebody didn't like the word revenue, but I think that if we're going to do public-private partnership, one of the things should be to fund transit on the corridor. So I look at these three as kind of all important. I think these ones remain important. This whole HOV, greenhouse gas stickers on your car, pay to be in the Lexus lanes, all the data shows that's all short-term anyway, right? Everything's filled up. It just doesn't do anything anymore. I got an electric car, I refused to put the stickers on because I figured it was bad policy to be taking up space to move people for the Clean Air Initiative. I get they're both valuable and I'm advocates for both. So when I look at these things, I land in this space. In terms of stations in the median, I want to make a counterpoint to Rod. I believe that most of the usage in this space is not, even if we subsidize it, not going to be general transit oriented. We know that stations in the median are not well loved by the public and do not have good ridership numbers. I don't think it's right to try and put median stations in this corridor at all. If we're going to do them, we should use, Rob mentioned it, the on-ramp, off-ramp model maybe, or short loops right off the freeway, but actually building them into the median where it guarantees anybody who wants to use them has to walk a half mile before they can get to anything. We already know is not effective. Again, we have data that shows all of this. So I'm not a fan of median stations. I am a fan of some select stations. I guess this stuff is out. Park and ride is a don't care because I don't know where we're going to put them. And high capacity is clearly out because every solution that we've talked about is not about equaling what you would get with cars. It's less than cars. Keep going, Johnny. You can circle all kinds of stuff. Years of being here, I have figured out how to work the screen. So there you go. I'm a trainable monkey. What can I say? Back to my big point. There are a lot of new people, members of the audience who are running for council. There are people up here. We have done 2+ years of great work and collected great data. If we could get republished the cell phone data, which shows the 1.9 million trips, if anybody's interested in the VTA ridership, you Google VTA ridership. There's a website that shows both the bus and the light rail ridership. For those who are interested, bus is now down to 21,000 and the light rail's at 27,000 for the entire networks. All of this is on VTA's website. And Caltrain has an equal site. They're 65,000, the entire Caltrain network. They continue to grow, by the way. And then the spaghetti diagram, which is the most comprehensive view of our actual corridor. And here is the bad part for everybody. I will just remind everybody, very few people transit the entire corridor. Very few people transit the entire corridor. How we make that work and how we satisfy the actual usage model that's out there is the challenge. I think it has to be a flexible system. I do believe that the corporate shuttles are going to play sort of a key element to this, and we cannot do anything that does not have public transit in it. It would be incorrect, it would be immoral, it would be the wrong answer for the citizens of this county. So those, they took my pictures away, but those were my boxes.
Thank you. Very quickly, to clarify my position, I agree with Vice Mayor, and that it would be Vice Chair, that it would be immoral not to have a public right-of-way in here. And one thing I requested at the last meeting in April was data from the private sector, asking them, what would you like to see transformed? And we've had a representative from the Silicon Valley Leadership Group here at both meetings in April and today, who is the Vice President of Transportation Policy. So I would encourage VTA at the next meeting, when the PAB reconvenes, that we have that input as I requested in April. And I'm happy to send a follow-up email. Thank you.
So Mason, just to clarify, you said public right-of-way. I think you do mean you want public transit service in the corridor from the get-go. Is that right?
Correct.
All right.
Okay, I'm going to take a shot at it. We're going to go a little bit over our proposed 2-hour limit, but we started a little bit late. So we're looking at this element. A couple of things is that high speed. Unless you have high speed, no one's going to get on it. So some of the other things are pointless. A lot of people are talking about private shuttles, and Johnny's out the room now, but what that does, if you get private shuttles, it gets cars off the road. Therefore, it does benefit the people sitting in the car. So everybody says, well, just because they're paying for it doesn't benefit us. That's ridiculous, because they're reducing congestion by 50 people in the car. That's 50 cars. Therefore, you can go freer, and therefore, it doesn't cost you a dime. So let's get that right on the table right away, is that people are concerned about, and let's just pick out Saratoga as a city that says, well, that's not equitable to us, even though you're more of the Bentleys than the Lexuses. So they, that to me, that's a non-factor. Forget it. I mean, because everybody's going to benefit if you get people moving into a more efficient moving in lanes. So fast speed has got to go. If you move people fast, you'll get the people to come on. One thing about data that you were showing is that not many people are coming from the South County along 85. Are they taking 101? Have we correlated the two? And if we give them a fast option, maybe they'll get on 85 with the next VTA bus and get there quicker. So don't look, are they taking 101 or are they taking Caltrains? Just because 85 is not clogging up with people, they have other options. So if we give them the only true transit option, other than Caltrain, but they can get that Express 185 to Rods, get them north on a bus efficiently, that's important. So we got to keep private shuttles in there and VTA. And, the ride shares people are talking, because, Uber has pool, anything, Director Bruins was talking about 3 or more in express lanes, and which is, I've always thought express lanes was not always efficient. But if you get the Uber pools, which may 4 or 5 people, those people would also be part of the private shuttles, and they would be in that particular lane. Medium stations. We all talked about, if it goes back to speed, if you have a lot of stations, we got to keep it minimal. We want to get it up and running. Also, we were talking about this, and to Howard's point about data and bringing it back, I think we have the data. I don't want to keep bringing it back, because that's going to move us backwards instead of moving forwards, because we already know that there are multiple entry points onto the transit lane, and so therefore we will take whatever additional VTA shuttle may evolve and be able to take people off of various Union Avenue or something and bring us north. So just because they go in a short distance, the future is that people can get on anywhere along the route, and there may be a bus somewhere that will take them more north instead of the short trip. So going back on this little string deal, spaghetti deal, it's nice, but I think that's moving us backward, because we have it, and we are trying to bring up goals that.
John, it was not backwards. There's a lot of new members here who have never seen the data, so I'm asking for the data to be provided to everybody again.
Well, okay, but I don't want to start talking about it, because Staff already seen it. We got it. There's a saying in Mountain View, and Don wakes up, trust staff to give us, we'll give you the goals, and then you got to find the solution for us. So with that, we're going forward with that. The other assumption was VTA at a point in time doesn't have dollars. At a point in time right now, they have contracts where we have to have riders, the drivers going. We are in current negotiations, and a lot of those solutions will come available to us. You're also pointing in point of time that Caltrain does not allow us to do certain things. That's a point in time. We have to push them to be more open-minded, be more innovative on our use of the lanes, and that's potentially going into the next alternative. But everything that you've pointed to us is a point in time, and I think Mason and Rod mentioned, yeah, we're evolving from that. So we may not afford it now, but some of your assumptions, again, and you're doing based on what we sort of asked, is a point in time, and I think there's solutions. We need to be looking beyond the limits of some of these assumptions. Frequency, yes, we got to start with peak hours, and then if it goes down, peak hours, directional. I mean, that's the obvious, and you said that was the assumed, and I'm glad you mentioned that's the assumed, but because you assumed it doesn't mean that the rest of us got it, so you know what assumed means. So let's make sure that's part of our current solution right now is what we're doing. The revenue, again, we don't have an option for people that can really get on the bus and improve the quality of life and move faster. And if once that's there, then the revenue potentially will come. If you are giving something that drives. When I talk to the corporate people, Mason, and they want solutions, they want to minimize the transfers. So the more transfers, it reduces the speed, and therefore reduces their ability for their corporate people to get on the bus, because that bus they get on goes immediately to their one destination. And so therefore, they have no incentive really to get on our public buses. But if we give them something to go move faster, that's what they're looking for. There were some other comments along there that I wanted to just point out my frustration, or just concerns about. Yeah, we're going to get to that. I just want to make sure I addressed everything in here. And some of the other comments that I want to go back against, or just give my point of view on something. So I think, okay, I'm sure I'll pop up with something else. But those things, so you got somewhat of a sense, if I cut myself off and say you got a sense of direction where we're taking some of your assumptions and saying, tweak them or whatever, go from there? Okay. Sure.
I brought up about potentially subsidizing someone's ride through Uber, like a teacher needed to do that. Is it private shuttles and or VTA transit, or is it just shuttles?
Well, I think that could be evolved. I think the model that Cupertino is coming up with paying for some shuttles within their town could be a potential offshoot of that, to say, hey, here's your main route. The city's going to figure out how to get them to that route.
Well, I'm even thinking because they are along the 85, not just. So I'm asking the semantics.
Well, the semantics is
just private shuttles and VTA transit.
well. That went back to Uber lifts or pools. That would go into that particular private shuttles with the Uber pools or the Lyft pools where they have multiple people, the car pools.
Even if it's subsidized.
We don't care who pays for it.
I'm just
what they're, yeah.
So
what
we're
they're
going
doing.
to get to those questions when you get to the
Okay,
last
well,
page
I'm
of
just
questions.
answering.
Yeah,
question.
I was under this page.
Okay, so let's ask staff, did you get enough on your vision to get you,
Yes, I think so. And I think we'll get more clarity in the next round of questions.
okay. So then let's jump to that alternatives. And I'm just going to start, I normally chair, I shouldn't do this, but I like the phrase that's board member Singh said about bottleneck. And you can't have a bottleneck as you just defeat the whole purpose. So with that being said, I will open it up to first one to raise their hands. Okay, Susan, you raised your hand first. She can answer all four because
Yeah,
we're short on
so-
time. If we do a round robin, it's good.
Okay,
No, but
so
do them all at once, just.
I'm going to go down the questions and then make some comments. Do the alternatives cover all desired ideas? I would say no, because we've already asked for some extras. Are station locations acceptable? I don't know where those locations are. I think a lot of the comments about stations and who actually uses them and if they like them should be answered. Who is allowed to use the transit lane? 100% needs to be everybody, whether it's buses or whoever, but everybody should have that right. It should not be the Lexus Bentley lane, as was stated earlier. Next steps, more revisions or start alternatives analysis. I don't think we're ready for alternative analysis because of the answer to number one of are there all the ideas covered. So that was my answers. Now, my comments are build it and they will come, pave the lane, figure out what it becomes later. Right-of-way costs are only going to go up. Land values are only going to go up. We need the long-term solution. We cannot just stop at 280. And at least you guys should be coming back with that to us and say, here is the critical right-of-way. Here's what it's going to cost now. Start looking at purchasing. Maybe you don't build it right away, but obtain the right-of-way to save money later and to look at the long-term solution. In regards to alternatives, where's the discussion about things like how software and on-demand busing or on-demand carpool and sharing? Where's this public-private partnership? Every large corporation has to have a congestion management plan. In those plans, are we looking for them to also be addressing this public-private partnership and contributions? You ride a bus and you have 40 of your employees on the bus, you got to pay for 10 other people to do something different. So that would be some kind of public-private partnership. Subsidizing, I've been mentioning this, give the teachers some credit for the whole commute. So interim solutions I think are very important. Like I said, pave it and we'll decide out how to stripe it later. Get the right of way. But we need to be expandable. We need to make sure that this is not a 1 year or 2 year solution. And a lot of this is changing our thinking of how to move forward and not just do the same old thing in the past, which is buy gigantic buses, pave a lane, and then not look at all of these other things that I've been mentioning here. I find it interesting, as one last comment is, there was a request earlier to know what cities made which comments, and on page 7 of the slides, it just says right there, Cupertino request, Mountain View request. Well, what else did the other cities request, and why are those all the only ones listed here that they may be included? So we need to move forward. We need to keep speeds going. We need to include all our people, but we need to be more flexible in thinking about what to do and basically plan ahead. Like I said, at least identify the right-of-way costs right now and it's got to be the long route. We've got to get to 101.
Okay, John's now back. Landry's just finished.
Okay.
Maybe Sinks is next.
Who-
You ready up?
So, see, hands?
I'm willing to go next.
Okay. Director Bruns?
Okay, so I'm going to say with the question, do the alternatives cover all desired ideas? No, for me, and I'll be very specific what I'm looking for, I really do believe we need a true, pure, no project alternative, which is the current configuration. When you have policymakers who wants to make decisions, you got to understand, if we keep kicking this can down the road and we keep doing analysis paralysis or don't even get to the analysis because we're paralyzed already or constipated, whatever way you want to put it, we need that one, okay, to make at least a case. Then I want alternative number 2, which you currently have as no project alternative. I would like this to be the express lane project, which is meaning the conversion of the HOV and the additional lane for express lane as well. And then the short transit and the long transit. I'm okay with how you guys have laid those out, even though I'm going to tell you I'm not a fan of the short transit lane because you're taking all the congestion and you are log jamming it. So in some ways, I almost want to say I would take that one off. I'd be willing to entertain taking that one off. But the short one says.
Oh, the short-term lane.
Yeah, it just says once we hit 280, it's a free-for-all, which then put cities like Los Altos in the cut-through lane, because that's where we are right now. Everyone's going to diverge at that point. So again, minimum, I'm asking for a true no project, and I'm willing to entertain scratching the short transit lane if we're doing a study, because I think we need to look longer than we need to look the fuller length. Are the stations locations acceptable? I am, okay, again, I hate the idea of saying station because that limits our thinking. But if we sit here and say we need a solution of some sort, whether it's a station, whether it's a park and ride, whatever, okay, a mega station type of point for collection or distribution after that. Stevens Creek makes a lot of sense to me. I'm not sure I really understand why El Camino. El Camino this is the first intersection when you pass 280 where you see a lot of grinding to a halt. But what's off of El Camino does not make sense to me. Instead, I am more in favor of looking at Evelyn Avenue because it's a piece that actually takes you in a desired location, whether you're going over to Sunnyvale, whether you're going over toward Mountain View to the job centers. Evelyn makes more sense as a job center distribution point, and to Caltrain. Okay, so to me, it has a lot of value to have that being a place that you do something to do a transit shift line. Let's see, in the question of who's allowed to use the transit lane, again, if we're talking about that transit lane, I am cast in stone on this one. I think we owe it to the public and all to look at making it truly a transit lane, not something that anybody and everybody gets to pay their way into. Because if you look at 85 today, and you look at the shuttle buses, and you look at the VTA 185, they are stuck in a heck of a lot of traffic. It's not appealing for, as a transit agency, to get onto a bus to sit in the same traffic as everybody else is. So I honestly believe we need to make it such that it is huge occupancy vehicles, so the private shuttles, the VTA, anybody else, if there's a car hailing service that has a minimum number of passengers in there, I can see that as well, but I'm not interested in single occupancy cars. I'm not interested in dual people in there. I really wanted to say, you got a few more, there's more to you than an individual automobile and its capacity. I also believe, I want to jump over to another question, which is that whole financial. I really believe if we're moving forward with this, I want us to move forward with this study, that we are going to be looking at the financial impact, not just revenue, because again, revenue limits our thinking. I want us to look at the financial things and the creativity around that in terms of public-private partnerships, et cetera. And I also want to say with the use of the transit lane, we also need to commit ourselves to a minimum amount of time before we go and try and say, oh, it's not working, pull the plug, because change of behavior is a long-term project. And then I really would like this body, I'm going to be very frank about it, I'm not interested in continuing to kick the can down the road. Every time we kick the can down the road, we have the change in membership, and we have a change in membership, we start all over again. So I would like us to, again, I think Adam did a great job. He started off by saying there's 3 phases to this. What we're doing today is trying to end phase 2, which is basically to identify the alternatives that go into the deeper dive now. And I think it needs to be at minimum, the ones that I said, and I think we should just be doing that with some of these other caveats on there in terms of understanding. So I'm not ready to say we need more revisions. This is the deeper dive, and I think we got to do it now. We just have to just bite the bullet, people. Go.
Director Sinks.
Well, Jeannie, I well respect your long service working on these hard problems, and I agree with you rather completely. Just a second. I appreciate I'm just going to reinforce these points. I appreciate staff working very hard to explore a different financial model for this corridor along the lines of what I've said before. I appreciate your willingness to entertain some, and I agree, we don't have to call them stations, but I mean, the objective, of course, is to allow, whether they're public buses or private buses, to allow them by whatever means, I mean, to make an exchange, to let people off, to let people on, and then quickly zip up the corridor. If it means, right, a dedicated lane, off-ramp, on-ramp situation, I'm good with that. If it means, no, we're in the middle of the corridor and we're going to have sort of an extended wing because we want this transit lane literally to be in the middle, I'm good with that too. I think it has to really depend on what's cost effective. But I do think we need, at selected points, the ability of not just vehicles to get on and off, but people to get on and off those vehicles. So yes, I would support the long transit lane alternative. I would support dropping the short lane transit alternatives. Makes no sense to me. I support the idea that to be transparent to everybody, right, that the no project alternative really means the mess we still got. And that, yes, there's another alternative called express lanes. So we are making conscious choices with language that the public can understand. The lawyers be, I don't know, damned, I don't know. So by the long transit lane alternative, I would hope that if we, through some combination of state law that enables shoulder travel in some places, or we determine that it's more easy to create circumstances for people to get on and off at a few selected spots by running that transit lane on the outside, that we consider that too, right? This is just an engineering problem to solve. Yeah, I would hope that we could, when we open this service, private employers would come flocking because they see an advantage in moving their employees more quickly. The general public, being skeptical of transit, sees that there's now a public bus service. And they say, hey, I'd rather be doing that. And we build ridership that way to a point where, this thing could be sustaining. But I think we are going to need a jump start. And I think we are going to have a discussion that goes just beyond the normal way we typically do this, which is the revenue way, to look at opportunities for a P3. So you can say I'm good.
Thank you. You spoke? Oh, I think you wanted to go last, or second to the last. Okay, go Howie.
Because I can say ditto to Jeannie and to Rod, which makes it really easy. Just to amplify a couple points. Some of us, there are 4 of us up here who've been working on this problem since the original Measure B, which for those of us who recall was a 2014 ballot measure before it got moved. Trying to figure out what goes on this corridor has been a nightmare. And we have, I don't want to use Jeannie's word, but we've gotten ourselves stuck. We need to move forward. I get it that everybody would like to catch up and go through everything all over again. Please distribute some data and let's keep moving because we don't want to get stuck. I want to amplify just a couple points. In terms of station locations, there is this nexus which has been brought up. Everybody knows it, but just to be super clear, Evelyn is like a point. If you had to pick one area as a high priority to figure out, that is a key connecting point between Caltrain, other bus lines.
Downtown Mountain View and Caltrain in particular.
That
right?
whole
Absolutely.
that whole area
Yep.
is like a key feeder point. And so
Quite agree.
if I had to say a highest priority for a location, that one needs to be sorted out first. And then who's allowed? I believe this should be a transit only. I would be willing to entertain larger, higher occupancy vehicles. I'm not interested in clean air stickers, paying to play, because those are all going to go away before we finish anyway.
Agree with you.
And even an HOV2 is not enough, and I think HOV3 is not enough. So I'm thinking high occupancy. And then the last bit,
I'll agree with that too. In the
Could you turn
interest
this
of time.
back?
Please agree with me.
No, I'm just trying to get some consensus, right? Because I didn't talk about each of these things.
The short analysis, I don't think makes any sense. I think the no alternative being do nothing, even though I understand the board has approved the express lane project already, that happened years ago, so that is the plan of record. I think we should give the no analysis, because I think that makes it very clear to the public what's going on. And then the last thing, which has been mentioned, but I think should be a priority, we used to have a Caltrans ex officio on this group. I think one of our highest priorities should be between the state legislature and Caltrans to understand what flexibility can be employed in a tight corridor to add in that other lane. And I think it's not just a, here's what we want to do. I think there is a gigantic legislative and engineering problem that should be running its own separate thread. And we should just consider that our cause for the state of California, because we're not the only ones who are going to need this. So solving that engineering problem. So I agree with everything that Rod and Jeannie said, and then I just tried to amplify a couple of points.
Thank you. Director Mason.
Thank you. I'll make it very quick. Ditto. I'm okay with dropping the short transit lane. The one thing I do want to add is for who is allowed to use the transit lane, it should be who is allowed to use the transit lane during peak hours or during a set amount of time, because that's very different than the off hours when we just say, oh, no single occupancy vehicle is allowed to use it from 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. or whatever. So
I'm going to do a red sinks ditto. That to me, that's
all I would point out is we do not need the capacity at those hours. So if
correct, I know it's obvious, but it's very important that that's made clear to the public. So thank you.
Okay. You already gave your comments, so you're good. Okay, so I will throw my sense into it. So I like what Director Bruin said about drop the short term. Can we give you that direction? Can you do that?
Yes.
Okay. Do we need to come back on an action item to say drop that alternative? Well, you're going to come back to us anyway with an action plan. So, okay,
right.
So that would be part of that.
And I'll have some comments at the end of your comments to summarize everything I've heard to make sure we're all on the same page.
Okay. You know, you guys say station locations. I like to use the phrase collection spots. Yeah. So it doesn't have to be, it just collects, but I know they go throughout the county to pick up bodies. So if we are going to take one of the primary users of private buses, we need to coordinate with them. So instead of trying to put them into our round hole, we might want to work for something in a triangle. So work that out. Who is allowed to use the transit lane? We said it from the get-go, from the day that Board Director Sinks brought us together in Cupertino, and was it Cupertino? Somewhere. And we said it has to be a transit lane, it has to be transit only. And this is something that's going to be bold for Santa Clara County. It hasn't been done, so we got to make it work. And one other, on this, it's going to be for Santa Clara County. There's this thing called potentially Fast Bay Area. Mountain View has already, as projects have put SR 85 on our list. So I'd like to see your other cities put it on that list so that we do get some input early on instead of getting overlooked on RM3 and some other projects. So if you go to your cities, put that on your wish list to get that onto to get money for funding on that.
What's it called?
Well, it's right now. Faster Bay Area, potentially. It's another leadership of project, and we will give him plenty of feedback on that particular item. So we already mentioned at the board that we need to have transparency throughout the cities, and so here's an opportunity to make sure that they reach out to all of us. Who is okay, and I agree totally. We keep going back and forth, start their alternative analysis. There's 4 of us, 5 of us are going to be out of here in 2020. Yes, 2, 3, boom, boom. The core group would like to leave this with something of a legacy that we actually got something started. And so,
amen, brother.
We want to get this moving. Okay, so I think, let's see what other assumptions that you wrote on this one that I sort of, again, disagree with. To say, okay, so you brought in some, again, I think some of your assumptions we didn't even address because I think we were looking above them, but there was the idea of PAB was expressed a preference to minimize number of stations as a way to save cost. I think it was more to save speed, because if you have stations, you reduce the speed, and we had to go back to speed.
Agreed.
Okay, you can speak. You also had a comment in there that a revised vision of a transit lane would mostly used by private shuttles and possibly infrequent public transit route that would make limited to no stops. Okay, the whole point was we were going to have public transit in there, and that's where our express lanes were going to come in. So that assumption, I disagree with what you have in your report. The VT imagined many stations to maximize the number of, that was your original, so you want to go low stations. I think, yeah, low or no stations would be more appropriate.
But you're good with Evelyn, right?
Evelyn, okay, Evelyn is what's specific, and that's not a station, that's an off-ramp, on-ramp. So that goes along that way.
And how about Stevens Creek?
Stevens Creek, again, is a natural, we find something down
Okay.
south. I liked what Johnny Camus was talking about. I just had to see you look up. About, we have to look at, on Golden Gate Bridge, they narrowed the lanes to get the 3 lanes in. That's why we have to be pushing Caltrans to start looking at narrowing the lanes so that we can get that right-of-way and move it through those areas. You have, I know certain lanes, and I do know there are some restrictions on the size of trucks that go through there, so, but yes, the,
We have truck restrictions on 85.
yeah, so if we have we could put truck restrictions on that, therefore you could narrow the lanes to 11 or 10.
We already have truck restrictions south of 85. We could extend it between the 101 and 280.
Yeah. So
Do
I
we
mean,
have the
so
power to do that?
we can
Does
request
it?
it.
I see.
Okay, so that's it. As you probably reasonable to assume that public transit on S-Ray in the future will be no more frequent than hourly service in the peak during direction hours, or if it exists at all. Okay, we're looking for optimistic results, and therefore we expect express buses to work because people will actually see that it's beneficial. Along that line. And I say, not realistic given the state of VTA's transit operating and new bus service model. That was again, you're looking at a point in time. I think we have a new light shine on our financial abilities. Also, anything that's coming along, VTA is now looking at operational costs to go along with capital costs. Hopefully that model will work now so that if we do put something in place, we will have the money to operate it. And I know we're not relying on sales tax because that's always hurt us in the past, and fare box recovery is not helping us out. Okay, so the reversible lane, I heard what you said about that, and that all ideas that should be analyzed rather than focused on specific details of each alternative. So, again, I appreciate the report. There was a lot of thought put into it, a lot of items to discuss and things that we might have, but this helped me narrow it down to what I think we need to go with. So do you think you have direction on this alternatives?
Well, let me tell you what's in my notes, and you can tell me if I'm right. I see PAB interest in evaluating a no-change alternative. We can also evaluate a no-project express lane alternative. There's interest in evaluating a long transit lane alternative.
Well, I think that was consensus of that's our direction we wanted to go to.
Yes, this is what I'm hearing. There's
Okay.
consensus in evaluating a long transit lane. There is not interest in evaluating a short transit lane alternative. I also heard Member Camus suggest an alternative, a vision for an alternative that would be the long transit lane with no stations, thinner lanes if that's achievable with Caltrans, and a pay-to-enter similar to an express lane model where private vehicles could get into excess capacity. I didn't hear that echoed by anybody
No,
else on the PAB. Is this something to
That wasn't
consider
the
at all?
consensus I gather either, the long-term
I
transit.
mean, honestly, isn't that just the express lane alternative? What's different about it?
It would be a long transit lane.
Well, that's
So there's the no change, the express lane,
alternative.
two express lanes, which I think covers Johnny's interests, the long transit lane, right? With a few number of stations, a small number of what did you call them? Collection points?
I call it collection points, yes, spots.
Okay.
So we get 3 alternatives to review.
And then that's the capital construction physical infrastructure piece. I'm also hearing interest in evaluating the potential for public-private partnerships to find operating funds that could fund VTA transit service in the corridor. Interest in looking at perhaps growing the service plan over time as funding becomes available, starting with peak and moving to something that is more frequent or more all day. Interest in looking into what sort of design exceptions may be possible through Caltrans, and checking in with businesses, and I'll follow up with Member Fong on his request to see how they can interact on this project. With that input, I'm happy to bring an action item to the next meeting that has the 3 alternatives that you just expressed interest in seeing, that'll allow you officially adopt them, and we can ask our project team to get started on the analysis so that we can do our best to wrap up the alternatives analysis before the end of the year.
Excellent.
Yes, Susan?
Is this, looking at buying right-of-way costs, is that going to be part of this? Because if we're doing the long option,
The alternatives analysis will look at the construction cost, which will include purchasing right-of-way if that's necessary.
thank you.
For those who aren't that familiar with north of 280, it's more of a physical constraints because there's a creek going along there that's really does some of the constraints on that, so.
So could I just add one thing? I've heard a couple
one thing.
discussions of revenue and so forth, and John, you said, you know, something about sales tax. I mean, I don't think any of our comments up here are interpreted to say we want to give up the 350 million that was won as part of
Never.
2016
I'm just
Measure
saying.
B,
And
right?
this money is only eligible to be used for capital funding, so it would not be operating funding.
Okay,
He mentioned
right.
operating a couple of times.
But one thing I think we ought to entertain is if we determine we need 650 million instead of 350 million, and those funds aren't available right now, even the 350, you know, we're not gonna see that for this project in the near term. I would like our discussion with business community to include helping us front load funding we would need to get this constructed sooner rather than later, and have that be part of the discussion. This idea that, you know, maybe you're helping us pay for this facility up front in exchange for a lower fee to use later on, for those businesses who are willing to step up, for example.
Don't forget Fast Bay Area.
So again, you know, let me just, I want to make it really clear for me. And again, wearing my hat as the former chair of the financial sustainability thing. These alternatives, when we go into these types of studies and all, so when we're looking at now, we got 3 alternatives that we're looking at, that we're going to be looking at everything in terms, including the cost for construction, okay, that capital expenditure. But I'm also making sure that we're also going to have another deliverable, which historically we haven't had, which is the operational cost, and looking at whatever those sub-alternatives, understanding what the operational cost is and what the alternatives might be to recover or handle those costs, absorb those costs, okay?
Absolutely.
So that's what I want to make sure that we're talking about. So open up our minds on capital as well as operational costs.
Do you have clear direction?
Yes, that's very good.
Scott, do you have clear direction?
Very clear, yes, thank you.
Okay. Any announcements? I will close the top and go to announcements. Any board members have any announcements? Oh, Jim.
On behalf of staff, we want to thank you for your input. This has been extremely valuable and helpful, and I wish you all a happy 4th of July.
Okay, we are adjourned until the next meeting.
Thank you, staff. I really do appreciate all the work that you've done.
Time to wake up.
I've got a job to do today.
I've got a job to do today.
Don't forget, you've got a job to do today.
Hey, Mom. I got the job. Thanks. I've got the job. Welcome aboard.
Have a good first day at work, Mom.
Your donations to Goodwill fund job training programs right in your community.
Feels good to start fresh, right?
Sure does. And like that, you're a job creator.
It's always wildfire season somewhere in America. Nearly 9 out of 10 wildfires are caused by the carelessness of humans and could be prevented. But together, we can make a difference.
Watch what I can do.
Help protect the home of our forest friends.
Come on, you can do it.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
To find out more, log on to SmokeyBear.com.
Before going out on any ride, it's important to make sure you have all your gear. The first thing to do is put on your helmet. It should fit securely and level on your head with room for just 2 fingers above your eyebrow line. When you shake your head, your helmet should not wobble around. Your chin strap should be tightly fastened with the V of the straps fitting snug under your ears. For rider visibility, the state of California requires all cyclists at night to have a white headlight that is visible from the front and a rear reflector that is visible from the back. In addition to those requirements, we recommend that you add a rear light to the back of your bike. Wearing reflective clothing is one of the best ways to make sure that drivers are able to see you while you ride. This means you should wear bright colors, a high visibility reflective jacket or vest, reflective ankle bands, and any other reflective products that will make you stand out to drivers. The more visible you are, the safer you will be.
This radio station broadcasts messages 24 hours a day for the citizens of Cupertino.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Claire Varesio. I am the community librarian at Cupertino Library. I'm pleased to have you all here for today's wellness program, Mindfulness, Meditation, Theory, and Practice. Our wellness programs focus on the other half of health, topics that you might not be discussing with your doctor, but that are very important for your overall health and wellness. And we're pleased to be able to bring you this series in partnership with Cupertino Library Foundation. And I would like to introduce from the foundation, Henry Sang, the board president, who will be giving a few words about the foundation and introducing today's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. I'm happy to see all of you here today because I know sometimes it's drizzling out there and you never know, whether you're going to get caught in the rain. Plus, it's hard to find parking here, right? So look, we are very happy, the Library Foundation, to be able to sponsor these types of events. And because we see what's happening in our community and we're finding out that our community is changing. The role of the library is changing, right? It used to be the place where you got books, right? And it was great when they had VHS tapes, and now you've got ebooks. In fact, I think I read more ebooks now than I do real books. But what CLF does is we serve two purposes, really. We are advocates for you, our community members. What new things do we need to learn about? Do we want to hear about? And how do we bring that to the library? How do we experiment with it? So just like Claire said, last year, we were just doing lectures. And this year we're saying, well, what happens if we do a little follow-up behind it? So that's why Sunil's going to come back in June. He's going to give 2 more of these. So can we do a little bit more? And, we're trying to experiment with that. So please, if you have ideas on the survey, write down some ideas for us. We're happy to entertain that. Now, I said we do 2 things. So that's us being an advocate for you and for ourselves and our families to do new things, right? That's how we evolve. We also are an advocate for the library itself, because it turns out, as a government agency, did everybody realize a library is actually part of government? Most people don't like government, but we all love our library, right? So, but there are things that they can't do and they can't advocate for themselves. And this is where we step up. In fact, that's how we got started 25 years ago, because for those of you who were here in the 90s, you remember there was one point when all of a sudden the hours that the library was open got cut to a bare minimum. I see some people shaking their head. Yeah, it was terrible. And so we started to advocate, to get money, to raise money, and then get our doors open. And our library is one of the most darling libraries in the United States. It's one of the most well-attended libraries ever, right? Do you know Claire and her staff did 656 programs last year? Whoa. Almost 900,000 people went through the door, right? Now, the thing is we need more space, because I don't know how many times I've been there, I couldn't find a seat. And also, the more programs that we want to do, we need actual room for it. The largest room over there is like 40 people can go in. And I tell you, if you came for the Alzheimer's talk, it was pretty crowded. So we are advocating with our city to expand the library. This room isn't as available as much as we really need it to be available. They have to do city events here. And so we're looking to do an expansion on it. And the good news is our city has said, yes, we want to do that. They've given us money on it, but guess what? The costs just keep going up and up and up. So one of the things I'm here to do today